Music, one of the most dazzling fruits of human civilization, is today a massive global phenomenon. And so it's hard for us to imagine a time when, in centuries gone by, people could go weeks without hearing any music at all. Even in the 19th century, you might hear your favourite symphony 4 or 5 times in your whole lifetime, in the days before music could be recorded. The story of music, successive waves of discoveries, breakthroughs and inventions, is an ongoing process. The next great leap forward may take place in a back street of Beijing or upstairs in a pub in South Shields. Whatever music you're into, Monteverdi or Mantovani, Mozart or Motown, Masho or mashup, the techniques it relies on didn't happen by accident. Someone somewhere thought of them first. Music can make us weep or make us dance. It's reflected the times in which it was written. It has delighted, challenged, comforted and excited us. In this series, I'm tracing the story of music from scratch. To follow it on its miraculous journey, there'll be no need for misleading jargon or fancy labels. Terms like Baroque, Impressionism or Nationalism are best put to one side. Instead, try to imagine how revolutionary and how exhilarating many of the innovations we take for granted today were to people at the time. There are a million ways of telling the story of music. This is mine. The years 1650 to 1750 were an age of invention and rapid innovation. Great discoveries were made in science and in music. Musical structures were transformed in the hands of composers like Handel and Bach. This period also saw the rise and rise of purely instrumental music and the birth of what became the modern orchestra. It was an age of transition where music blossomed from being a private affair to a public spectacle. Small wonder that the music of this age of invention is still staggeringly popular in our own 21st century, from the shores of Tristan da Cunha to the concert halls of Beijing. We live in a technological age, so we can identify with what it was like to live in the late 17th century, when innovations were also coming thick and fast. And to understand our music today, we need to go back to a time when many of its now familiar components simply didn't exist. Imagine a time when leaping from this chord to this chord was a painful experience, or from this one to this one. Imagine a time when an oboe and a trumpet struggled to play the same tune together. Imagine a time when no one had thought of stringing together a chain of chords in a pleasing sequence, like the one that begins this song by Keane.
An empty land. I knew the pathway like the back of my hand.
What makes so much of the music we enjoy today sound the way it does is a series of discoveries that burst into life in the 17th and early 18th centuries. laws governing the use of chords, which chords you could use, and what instruments you could play them on, all slid into place like the parts of a magical and intricate machine. People of the period were obsessed with the interplay of cog and wheel, the laws of motion and gravity, and the understanding of the dimension of time itself. No wonder it was a period that saw great advances in clockmaking. Listen to the music of this period and you hear the ticking of clocks, the perfectly calibrated whirring and spinning of cogs, the turning of wheels and the to and fro of pendulums. The most striking thing about this age of invention is how the exhilarating speed of scientific investigation was reflected in constant experiment and innovation in music. In the 100 years between 1650 and 1750, music underwent a massive upgrade. It went from this to this. Though nowadays it includes instruments of all shapes, sizes and types, the orchestra grew from just one leg of ham-sized package. A folk fiddle version of the violin had been around for some time, but the more sophisticated type we recognise today began its journey in Italian workshops in the late 16th century. Only really coming into its own as leader of the instrumental pack in the following century. The violin's rise went hand in glove with that of the extravagant absolute kings of France, Louis XIII and XIV, who brought in Italian experts to play for their flamboyant royal ballets. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a passionate fan of the ballet, even giving himself starring roles in them, no doubt to gasps of Gallic delight from the assembled courtiers. The ballets were on a fantastic scale, often performed in palace halls or outdoors, so the bright, edgy sound of the violin was just the ticket to fill the space. In fact, not just one violin, but loads of them. One violin good, 24 violins better. You might have 10 or 12 or even 24 violins playing the same tune. Similarly, when they started adding in larger, deeper tone models of the violin family, like violas and cellos, they were also grouped together to play the same musical line. This, then, was the beginning of the modern orchestra. The musician in charge of the Royal Violin Band for over 30 years was Jean-Baptiste Lully, who created a thicker, grander ensemble style, especially for this beefed-up ensemble. There was another important innovation for which dance was responsible. Louis XIV's long, colourful ballets would begin with a self-contained instrumental introduction, or opening, the French word for which is ouverture. The Italians called it sinfonia. These overtures were soon borrowed by opera too. They then began to develop into longer and longer orchestral pieces, eventually becoming the symphony. The symphony's basic structure was also to come from dance. Sections of different dance music, pavans, sarabands, gigs, etc., began to be gathered together into suites, often in groups of 3. That's right, the 3-piece suite was actually invented by 17th century musicians. But the idea of linked music at different speeds came to dominate the symphony and did so until the end of the 19th century. In the late 17th century, another crucial part of the musical toolkit was put into place. The composer who first introduced many of the innovations that Vivaldi, Bach and Handel built on, and which we now take for granted, was Arcangelo Corelli. Corelli was the first violin virtuoso, and he built on his love of the violin an idea that took off spectacularly. He gathered stringed instruments together into groups and created for them a new form, the concerto. Now, the concerto, where a small group of players alternates with a larger group, makes its impact by contrasting loud and soft passages, like the juxtaposition of light and shade, chiaroscuro, in painting. Corelli's innovation was called the Concerto Grosso, literally the big concert. And in it he explored the contrast between a small group, just 2 violins and a cello, called concertino, and a bigger group of everyone else, called the ripieno, meaning the stuffing. Every composer in Italy now had a stab at writing concerti grossi. One young Venetian admirer of Corelli was to make the concerto as famous as pizza. His name was Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi took the big group, little group idea one step further, casting a charismatic solo violin against the whole ensemble. The solo concerto announced its arrival on the musical stage with a set of pieces that were to become, in the 20th century, deservedly ubiquitous. Vivaldi's concertos introduced a sense of drama and virtuosity that took his contemporaries' breath away. In effect, he was turning his violinists and cellists into divas to match the opera stars of the day. What makes Vivaldi's music so exhilarating is its sense of forward momentum. How this was achieved was, in itself, a giant leap forward. It's all about the movement of chords, and it's one of the most fun things in all music. Whatever you're playing, just having one chord after another in a random succession is not really very appealing. Which is why hardly anyone ever does it. So how do you decide how to string chords together in patterns that don't sound like random twaddle? In the 17th century, by experimenting with chains of certain chords in a sequence, composers stumbled across a concept students of music call harmonic progression, but could just as easily be described as musical gravity. The laws governing actual gravity had been formulated in the late 17th century by Sir Isaac Newton. Just as he revealed the inner workings of the universe, so too musicians at the same time worked out the inner gravity of music. They made the important discovery that some chords have an attraction to other chords. So this chord, known to every guitarist as G7, is drawn magnetically towards the chord C. To put it another way, chord 5 yearns for chord 1, especially when it's corrupted by the 7th note. Here's chord 5, and here it is with the corrupting 7th note. And here is where it wants now to go. The same law of magnetism applies to every key family, no matter which one you choose. So A flat 7 leads to D flat, B7 leads to E, F7 leads to B flat, and so on. In the 1600s, musicians became obsessed with these laws of attraction. Composers found that stringing sequences of chords together to trigger this attraction drove the music along. A master of this technique was English composer Henry Purcell. Born just around the corner from Westminster Abbey, where he later worked, Purcell survived the Plague and the Great Fire of London, so he knew a thing or two about moving on. His music makes creating imaginative chains of chords look effortless. All he needed was a short sequence that repeated itself a number of times, and he constructed for himself a whole song. In his Evening Hymn, published in 1688, he sets up a simple sequence of chords. This sequence he then repeats 5 times, followed by a middle bit, where he has a second sequence. Then he returns to his original chord sequence for another 13 times to finish the song off. The amazing thing is, you don't get bored with the sequence, despite its repetition. That's because Purcell overlays onto it a ravishingly beautiful melody that follows its own meandering path across the top.
That the sun hath veiled his light and bid the world good night, to the soft bed, to the soft bed, my body I dispose, but where shall my soul repose?
Look at this painting by Vermeer, which was finished in 1664. At first sight, the colours appear to be vivid and well defined, but look closer and we discover that Vermeer creates this effect by layering colour upon colour, each subtly blending into the next. This melding of colours is like the way harmony works in music. Notes are laid on top of each other to make constantly shifting chords.
Praise the mercy that prolongs thy days.
The chord progression in Purcell's Evening Hymn was to pop up in countless other pieces by other composers in the decades that followed. Indeed, composers went back to the same few archetypes time and again. The most popular sequence by far even had its own name, the Circle of Fifths. This This sequence used the 7th note to trigger chord after chord to jump ship from chord 5 to chord 1. On a piano keyboard, you can even make a circle of fifths include every note and chord there is, like this. Starting on B, I add the seductive 7th to take me to E. I add the 7th to take me to A, and so on. Arriving back where I started on B. A chain of 10 moves like that would be excessive, and in fact not possible on the keyboard instruments of Corelli's time. But he and all his colleagues would happily string a sequence of 3 or 4 or 5 moves together. Here is the circle of fifths in a Christmas concerto by Corelli. Here's the same thing in a piece by Vivaldi. And again in Handel. What may surprise you is that the dozen or so favourite chord sequences beloved of composers around 1700 are still the top dozen harmonic sequences mined by composers of all styles today. Here's just one example, a sequence that involves a downward stepping bass progressing from chord 1 to chord 5. The magic of these evergreen chord sequences wasn't lost on the 17th and 18th century composers who discovered them. Before long, they were able to construct whole sections of music without a melody at all. Once again, it was Vivaldi who set the gold standard. In the opening of one of the concertos in his best-selling collection published in 1711, unashamedly labelled L'estro armonico, the inspiration of harmony, Vivaldi takes us on a gripping, suspenseful journey through chords alone. Vivaldi's music was in demand all over Europe, and he often conducted it in person to great acclaim in the major cities. Indeed, the years from 1600 to 1700 had been completely dominated by Italian taste, expertise, sensuality, and flair. Along with Corelli and Vivaldi, practically all the other composers who dominated the 1600s were Italian. What's more, they all had names ending in I. Vivaldi, Corelli, Albinoni, Monteverdi, Cavalli, Bononcini, Stefani, Vitali, Lanelli, Frescobaldi, Cellini, Torelli, Locatelli, Valentini, and the brothers Scarlatti. But then the musical world began to tilt on its axis, and Italy began to be eclipsed in the musical firmament. Vivaldi himself was to become a victim of this redrawing of Europe's musical map. The popularity Vivaldi enjoyed during his middle age did not last, and after living most of his life in Venice, he decided to move to Vienna in his 60s, where he died lonely and impoverished. For the next 200 years, his prolific body of music, including 500 concertos and over 40 operas, would stay silent, his career forgotten. Almost. Vivaldi's legacy survived in the somewhat surprising influence he had on two other composers, Johann Sebastian Bach and George Frederick Handel. The centre of gravity of the musical world had moved north over the Alps to Germany, from the home of Roman Catholicism to the wellspring of the Reformation. Bach and Handel both learnt from the Italians, especially Corelli and Vivaldi. They also took what they fancied from the French violin bands and proto-orchestras. They incorporated the inventions and technological advances of their time and created something extraordinary of their own that grew out of the particular North German Lutheran culture that they were born into. Lutheran congregations were active participants in the church service, with communal hymn singing being given high status. Just as the Reformation swept away the elaborate decoration favoured in Roman Catholic churches at the time, so too in Protestantism the music was always in service of the message, making the gospel radiant, unfussy and clear. A huge amount of what Bach wrote, including virtually all his 300-plus cantatas and his vast output of organ music, is based one way or another on German Protestant hymn tunes, or chorales. He would weave a tapestry of sound around a hymn, being sung or played slowly through the centre of the work, as he does here in Jesus bleibet meine Freude, Jesu, joy of man's desiring. All Bach's vocal music is focused on one thing: devotion to God in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth. Whatever he does musically, however complex, he does to enhance the meaning of the words. Take this aria from his St. John Passion, Zerfließer mein Herze. If we deconstruct its opening instrumental phrase, we see that it's a series of exquisite chords with a gently descending bass line. 15 chord changes in about 10 seconds. But when the voice joins in, Bach's harmonies become even more daring, allowing notes to clash against each other in swiftly moving discords. Here are the dissonances tucked into just the first short vocal phrase. The dissonances may be cleverly disguised, but they're still there because Bach wants to create a feeling, subliminally, of anguish and grief, which is exactly what the words of this aria are trying to convey. If Bach's aim in his choral music is to move and inspire, in his instrumental music he wants to dazzle. He's the undisputed master of all time of the musical technique of counterpoint, the interweaving of different tunes.